must have given away 100 copies of this book. And I give it to people thinking, I don't tell them, well, I don't tell most of them, that if they don't like this book, if they don't love the book, then I'm incapable of loving them. So it's become a test of character for me.
People will come into the shop and they'll know exactly what it is they're after, but they won't remember the details, and they'll say, I'm looking for this book. It's kind of foreign sort of sounding, maybe with like a guitar or a piano, and you know exactly what it is they're after.
You know, each page seemed to me like quite a complex poem, and I do like to have a book to read that doesn't just float through your eyes and out to the other side of your head. It kind of took a bit of work, and there were quite a few words in it that I didn't understand, and I quite like having to go and look things up.
It is a very strange feeling to be back on this island after 4 years. Since writing Captain Corelli's Mandolin, my life has changed a great deal, and I think that I myself have changed somewhat. When I last came here, I was, I suppose, a rather dejected school teacher working with difficult kids, and it was only for 2 weeks.
I'm never particularly interested in an author or an artist. It's the work that matters. And yet when you look at somebody like Dr. Janis or Carlo, that selfless hero, you wonder, where did they come from?
When I wrote my first novel, I was working as a supply teacher at a school in southwest London. The disadvantage of being a supply teacher, of course, is that you have to be able to tackle any subject at a moment's notice, and it often just degenerates into a kind of riot control. The advantage of being a supply teacher is that you don't have much lesson planning to do, and you don't have any marking to do. So I was able to come home at 4 o'clock or 4:30 and get down to work and work solidly until bedtime. I wrote 3 novels whilst I was a supply teacher, and by the time I'd finished my third, I was pretty much near the statutory nervous breakdown that all teachers have to have. And I was lucky with Captain Corelli's Mandolin because it took off rather well, so it made leaving teaching quite easy.
One of the most satisfying things about the book is the history, the passage of the book's success, because it was a book about which I think the publishers felt rather sceptical. They thought, does anyone want to read this book set in the war? It's long and it's complex and it's got a lot of characters, and will it engage anyone? So they didn't put in their habitual hype, mercifully. And it has been passed around like samizdat. And it's a brilliant vindication of the power of the reader and the triumph of the values of the reader over the values of commercial exploitation.
I first heard about the book on a golf course, of all places. 2 friends of mine that I play golf with were raving about this book. And then that evening I was working, and a young lady in the back of the cab was reading this book, totally engrossed in it, bursting out laughing at the funny bits. So I had to ask her, what she was reading, and she said, well, Captain Corelli's Mandolin's a fantastic book. So I had to go out and buy it, and that's how I come to hear of it.
Captain Corelli's Mandolin has been in the bestsellers list pretty much constantly since it came out in paperback, which was about 3.5 years ago, and that's pretty phenomenal for a single book.
The reason why I like the book so much is because of the descriptions of a very warm island. I can smell it, I can be there in my thoughts. While I was reading it, I was there all the time. I didn't exist anymore in normal life.
I first came to Kefalonia because my girlfriend at the time was fed up with going to France every year on holiday. She said, please, let's go somewhere else. So she arranged to come to Kefalonia. It was her idea. And you get into the tourist bus. The first thing you hear from the tourist guide is, after the earthquake in 1953, I was instantly interested because an earthquake is a big dramatic event which can find a place in a novel. we hired a motorcycle, my girlfriend and we went around all over the island. I decided to start researching for the story almost as soon as I had heard about the earthquake. I took a lot of notes in between, snorkeling and getting sunstroke. I can't really say whether it's a sense of place or a sense of history that makes me want to write a story. The important thing is that the story has to be good. I'm always looking for a good story first and foremost. But with Captain Corelli's Mandolin, I think what really did the trick was walking around the ruined villages that had been left over after the earthquakes. There's a very strong feeling of a vanished community, places full of ghosts, lost ways of life. Here in Kefalonia, we are in part of the ancient kingdom of Ithaca, where Odysseus was the king. Ever since the time of Homer and before, this whole region has been drenched in mythology. And there's something about this mythology which gives the place historical depth. It's rather wonderful just to go to the island next door, to Ithaca, and wander about thinking, this is where King Odysseus lived in his palace with his bodyguard of Kefalonian giants. And his ships were made of Kefalonian pine. The pines on this island only grow here and in small parts of Russia. When you just arrive as a tourist in a place like this, you don't really connect much with the real life that is going on around you. And one of the things that always strikes me coming to a place like Greece is seeing the old peasant women and the old men on donkeys with their impressive white moustaches and 3-day stubble. It's as though they inhabit a different universe from you. And when you are arriving at a place that has no context. So you think, this is paradise. How wonderful. These people have been leading beautiful pastoral lives for centuries. What perfect peace. When I started to investigate this island and its recent history, I realized that a great deal more has happened than you might think. There have been major catastrophes, major events in the history of this little place, going back more than 1,000 years.
What draws me to the book is that it's like a fable. It somehow has the air of having always existed in the way that Homer has somehow always existed. So it has a sort of mythic quality for me, and partly because its themes are the preoccupations of myth, love, war, peace, love, hatred.
When you think about the theme of the book, in one way, technically, you could say it's war. War links the whole plot together, the ludicrousness of the motives, the destruction, and at the end, the sheer horror of how war has destroyed all that is most noble in the Greek people. But in a way, I think that's just the technical theme. The real theme is how do people love? And what war does is put them under pressure. As it were, spotlight them, stretch their fabric, so we can see what they're really made of. And what people love turns out not to be often what we would expect.
Every character in a novel owes its origin to something, and one of the major characters in the book is called Pelagia. Now, I got the idea for Pelagia because I was sitting in a cafe in the main square of Argostoli, and in the cafe next door there was a young Greek woman serving at the tables, and I was watching her in the way that men do tend to watch girls. We can't help it. And it struck me that I wanted a young Greek woman in a novel. Later on, somebody told me about the invasion by the Italians, and it seems that they and the Greek population had reached a sort of a compromise, an accommodation. They got on reasonably well, and it seemed to me a very obvious idea to have a romance between an Italian and a Greek. I decided that I really must write this story.
about Kefalonia. And the girl from the cafe became Pelagia. Her father, Dr. Janis, appeared more or less on his own. And I decided to write the story up more or less up to the present, against the dramatic contemporary history of Kefalonia.
Kefalonia is at the interface of Italy and Greece. There's a lot about this place which is somewhat Italian, but the Kefalonians are also like other Greeks in that they have an immense amount of pride in their own place. So Greeks always say, in my village we have the water that tastes the most like water anywhere in the world. We have the clearest light. Yeah? And one of the things that Kefalonians, I think, believe about themselves, well, particularly the women are very beautiful and the men are very intelligent and witty. In the rest of Greece, they say Kefalonians are crazy.
In his personal history of Cephalonia, this is how Dr. Janis describes his island. It is a light that seems unmediated, either by the air or by the stratosphere. It is completely virgin. It produces overwhelming clarity of focus. It has heroic strength and brilliance. The dark green of the pines is unfathomably and retreatingly deep. The ocean viewed from the top of a cliff is platonic in its presentation of azure and turquoise, emerald, viridian, and lapis lazuli. The learned doctor leaned back and read through what he had just written. In the margin he wrote, "Remember, all Cephalonians are poets. Where can I mention this?" He went out into the yard and relieved himself into the patch of mint. He nitrogenated the herbs in strict rotation, and tomorrow it would be the turn of the oregano. He returned indoors just in time to catch Pelagia's little goat eating his writings with evident satisfaction.
One of the most interesting things about the book was the way that Dr. Janis was trying to write an objective history of the island, and he failed so miserably because everything about the island and the way he feels about it made it really personal. Even when he's talking about the invaders of the island, the Romans and the Venetians, and even the British, he does it with a kind of wry affection, so that when he's making a comment about the inconsistency of the British and how you never knew they were going to hand you a bag of gold or a bag of vipers, it's really very funny.
My Dr. Janis he is a brave man. He stands for something, and the reason he stands for something is because he has a lot of love in his heart. Almost everybody in that book is motivated by love, even Mussolini, who loves Italy and loves himself. Mussolini had formed a pact with Hitler that he called the Pact of Steel, but as it turned out, Italy didn't enter into the war at the same time as Germany, and so it wasn't until 1941 that the Italians invaded Kefalonia. One of my characters in the book says rather acerbically that Mussolini was a moral and intellectual pygmy. That may be a little bit harsh, but he was certainly deluded into thinking that he could run all of Italy in every detail, all on his own. He was even deciding what types of bootlaces the soldiers should have on their boots. He made foreign policy that was different from his foreign minister, Count Ciano, and he completely disregarded all the counsel of his military advisors. It seems that he was just desperate not to get left out when there was so much going on. So Mussolini was a man who was in many respects a buffoon, but the great puzzle is how he managed to keep power in Italy for so long. History ought to consist of the anecdotes of the little people who were caught up in it. This is something that, as a novelist, I believe and also find useful. It really is much better, I think, to have a first-person narrative by somebody who was involved in the Albanian War, or by somebody who is involved in, the Italian occupation.
Parce que tous, pas d'exception, nous avons tenté qu'on tous les moyens de sauver Italien. Et nous avons réussi de sauver 7000. 7000 Italiens furent sauvés.
Stalin once said that one death is a tragedy, but a million deaths is a statistic. And I think this is very true. My parents went through the war, and I grew up listening to their anecdotes and stories. And it made everything much more personal. My mother, for example, lost a fiancé, and my father's house was bombed, and his entire regiment was wiped out in one battle in Italy. What I'm saying is that history is personal. War is personal.
A good thing about any book, TV or film, I think, is if it makes you want to go out and read a bit more about some of the factual things behind it. And therefore, you know, Greece's involvement in the war was something I hadn't really paid an awful lot of attention to, and it was something I was quite interested in as a consequence of that. I didn't even know there was a place called Kefalonia. Thought it was a part of the brain.
I do, but possibly quite wrongly, associate much of modern British writing and modern American writing with a certain sort of misanthropic, amoral coolness. It's as though these people are writing without passion, and if they want to prove anything, it's how despicable the human race is. I, on the other hand, am much more optimistic about life. I generally like human beings wherever I go, and I also like to tackle classical themes in literature, which I think most modern writers try to avoid because they're embarrassed about it. I think it has become unfashionable to have books with heroes. We live in a somewhat cynical time, when particularly the intelligentsia are so relativist that they don't have any kind of grip on moral or artistic standards at all. I'm pretty much old-fashioned in this respect. I like to hark back to the long-standing traditions that we've had in literature and in theatre, where you do have heroes, you do have people who are decent and brave and who have fine feelings. I do not believe that these people are to be scoffed at, that they're not to be thought of as naive.
I think one of the reasons that the book is so popular is that the values are humane values. They are, if you like, values of Christian love, love thy neighbour as thyself, and that it is a book which, above all, argues love as a redeeming quality. And you know, the good people get happy, the bad people get some sort of punishment. I mean, I'm not suggesting there's a crude moral scheme, because it's very sophisticated.
Captain Corelli at one point says to a German friend of his, Weber, Gunther Weber, he says to him, "I don't have the luxury that you have of thinking that I'm superior to these people." I think the major reason that accounts for the difference between the behaviour of the Italians here and the subsequent behaviour of the Germans was that the Italians had no racial theories. They saw no big difference between themselves and the Greeks.
To some extent, you know, it's a romantic book in the sense that, you know, a lot of soldiers coming into a Greek village wouldn't behave quite as well as they did, you know. In fact, nowhere near as well as they did.
Captain Corelli, and I think the Italians who were really here, when they saw the Greeks, they saw themselves. They saw people who looked like themselves and acted like themselves. And Corelli says at some point that, you know, to make sure that I behave myself, that I keep myself, to keep my integrity, I imagine that these women are my sisters or my mothers, and I imagine that these old men are my father. That's how I retain my humanity, even though I'm a soldier. After I finished the book, I was in fact a little bit worried about whether Corelli was a properly rounded character, because he was more of an invention than, for example, Dr. Janis was. But I get any number of letters from people saying that they've fallen in love with Captain Corelli. So I can't have done too badly.
What I always think about when I think of him as a character, when he first meets her after he's made a fool of himself and the whole legion, he sees her and he falls on his knees and he grabs her hands and he wants to kiss her on her knees, and this looks like it's drama, it's show, but I can see Italians doing this. It's nothing strange. This is really what happens.
I think the thing about Corelli in the situation that he is maintaining his sense of humour is, something that I'm very aware of, having been a psychiatric nurse, having worked with the police quite a lot, and with ambulance men. People in the most difficult situations always have the best sense of humour, because it's always much darker, it's always much sicker, and it's always much funnier.
See, the wonder of this book is that it's terribly funny. The last Scala, the singing in the latrines every morning, and all that wonderful interplay of characters when Captain Corelli comes to lodge at Dr. Janis. But it's so shot through with a sense of context. There's war all around, there's heartbreak all around. It's true humour. It's sweet and it's deep and it's very funny, but it's very rarely brassy and bright and two-dimensional. Not so much jokes here. It's the kind of humour that makes you understand why Dante wrote the Divine Comedy.
I think that this piece here illustrates the humour and humanity in the book, and it's certainly a piece that's just stuck in my mind ever since I've read it. I first came across Captain Corelli in the latrines of the encampment. His battery had a latrine known as La Scala, because he had a little opera club that shat together there at the same time every morning, sitting in a row on the wooden plank with their trousers about their ankles. He had 2 baritones, 3 tenors, a bass and a countertenor, who was much mocked on account of having to sing all the women's parts, and the idea was that each man should expel either a turd or a fart during the crescendos when they could not be heard above the singing. My first experience of La Scala was hearing the Anvil chorus at 7:30 a.m. I noticed an appalling and very rank stench, but I went in, only to see a row of soldiers shitting on their perches, red in the face, singing at full heart, hammering at their steel helmets with spoons.
The real importance of music to me is that I wish I'd been a composer instead of a writer. I think it's really rather piffling to be a writer by comparison with being a composer. I hope there is such a thing as reincarnation, so that I can have another bash in the next life. In this life I have an insufficiency of education and talent. The philosopher Schopenhauer said that music was the way of getting directly to meanings, almost unmediated. And I feel this too. Music is a kind of international language. If you like music, you can find another musician or make music with, anyone, anywhere in the world.
I got a nice letter plus a CD from Alison Stevens, who is, I suppose, one of Britain's 2 great mandolin players. I think she's captain of the London ladies football team as well. I'm never going to play the mandolin to her though, because she's too good.
Musically, my favourite passage in the book is when Louis describes Captain Corelli trying to play the Hummel concerto to Dr. Janis, and that Dr. Janis gets exasperated by him tapping his foot for what seems like ages, and it turns out to be the 46 bars of orchestral introduction before the mandolin comes in.
I think in Corelli, music acts as a metaphor for both the divine inspiration, but also for harmony, for the best in human nature. And so the mandolin, which is a very sort of delicate instrument, it's a metaphor, obviously, for woman, but it's also a metaphor for the sort of fragility of the human spirit and the potential eloquence of the human spirit, because a mandolin is nothing until it's played.
That piece is from the Dodecanese, or the Dodecanesos, but which is obviously a long way from here. But the words are very, very typical. You find the words to this song all the way from Crete to Anatolia, and it's about seeing a girl in a tree and asking her to come down so that you can build a nest with her, and instead she throws apples at you.
Captain Corelli truly believes that he loves Pelagia. And since he's one of our heroes, we believe it with him. But in fact, he doesn't. She may love him, not absolutely sure, but she may well love him. She certainly thinks she loves him. She thinks that right to the end. But it's quite clear that what he really loves is Antonia. That mandolin, and how significant that it has a woman's name. It's his music that he loves. The author has such esteem for music, he thinks it excuses everything. And against such a master of words, who would like to take up the lance? Not me.
It is in fact music that makes Pelagia realise that Captain Antonio Corelli is special. He wakes her up in the morning practicing, and she thinks it's such a lovely thing to wake up to. When she watches his hands on the fingerboard, she sort of, I think she says something like, it wasn't just fingers, it was his soul embodied in his fingers. And she perceives Antonio Corelli, well, very much through his music. That's her route to his heart, and his route to her heart. I like to choose names that suit people. Pelagia means ocean, and a pelagic current is one that travels miles and miles in a circle and comes back upon itself. So Pelagia is a pretty name, but her life goes in a big circle and comes back more or less to where it started.
At different times, different characters become your favourite. I mean, Dr. Janis himself reminds me so much of my own father, and the relationship between him and his daughter is so strong and so funny, and so many of the things that said between them are such universal truisms that both of them, for me, really are my favourite characters. She has aspects of so many of my friends in her and myself in her, and it's just very special to see such a well-written female character in a book written by a man.
All of my intimate friends are women. I find them easier to talk with. And you don't have this sort of male competition about who's more macho or who's more clever or who's got more money and all that sort of stuff. Women are more fun.
There's a description of love which Dr. Janis gives to his daughter Pelagia, and it's very, very beautiful and also true. And it goes like this: love is a temporary madness. It erupts like volcanoes and then subsides. And when it subsides, you have to make a decision. You have to work out whether your roots have so entwined together that it is inconceivable that you should ever part, because this is what love is. Love is not breathlessness, it is not excitement, it's not the promulgation of promises of eternal passion. Love is what is left over when being in love has burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew towards each other underground, and when all the pretty blossom had fallen from our branches, we found that we were one tree and not two. And I think that's just very, very beautiful and eloquent and not overwritten, and is a really perfect example of the delicacy with which this book treads a line between stating truisms, being, as it were, proverbial, and uncovering truths about people which are very, very profound.
I think it's very definitely a love story. I think it's possibly the most beautiful love story I've ever encountered. But I also think it's very much a history.
I think a love story is too simple. Really is too simple for the book. As I say, I feel it's about the human spirit and how it deals with adversity.
Love is the hardest thing to write about, but it is the most common motive after all, and you can't really, I think, write an honest book in which people are unmotivated by love. It's certainly an important thing in my life. You know, I have many friends and my family is very close. You know, I am close to my cat. I find that it is becoming increasingly difficult to make somebody else into my entire universe, which is what normally happens when you're in love. You know what I mean? Love is different from being in love. I've either forgotten how to do it, or I can't do it anymore, which is, you know, just to turn somebody else into everything. I realised after a couple of sort of romantic episodes that it was actually a great mistake to make somebody else your entire universe, because when they leave, your universe collapses. So I've learnt this lesson the hard way. The process of writing certainly interferes with my normal life. I get so completely immersed in the little world that I've created and all the characters who have come out of my mind that I don't or can't concentrate on normal life, and everything falls by the wayside, including my friendships and my personal relationships. The only thing I manage to do conscientiously is the washing up.
I dedicated most of my life to not having a career, so I was determined not to ever have to work in an office and put on a tie. So I've worked as a landscape gardener, I've worked on a ranch in South America, I was briefly an officer cadet at Sandhurst. I worked as a groundsman in a mental hospital. I've worked in bookshops. I've been a carpenter, a car mechanic, a motorcycle messenger.
Do you want to take a bottle of Retsina in?
Yeah,
Is there any there's masses of Retsina in the fridge.
Fridge.
I love cooking. When I was writing Captain Corelli, I was cooking and eating Greek food all the time and drinking Greek wine, knocking around with Greek people. I call it method writing. Smyrna meatballs!
My next book is set in southwest Turkey between about 1900 and 1923, another period of very dramatic events. One of the characters in Captain Corelli is Drosula. She was originally a refugee from Asia Minor, so I'm going to have her in the next book as a young girl and as a young woman.
I think my favourite character in the book is Drusula. She's like a very ballsy character. She's not attractive at all, and she sort of portrays the sort of tragedy of the woman that's not beautiful, if you like, but she's developed, like a lot of women that aren't beautiful, the most kind of amazing personality, and she's very funny, and she's a bit scary, and she intimidates everyone, and I know how she feels.
The beginning is difficult because there are so many characters that get introduced for quite a lot of pages, so that carries on, and most people perhaps might be a little bit put off by it. But I actually enjoyed it. I thought it really built up a story.
Whenever I write a book, I think of a geometrical structure for it. The structure of Captain Corelli's Mandolin was a sort of pyramid. It started with a very wide base, including an awful lot of people. The number of characters gets fewer and fewer until at the end you're only left with, I think, 3 or 4.
This sort of ball of excitement that keeps rolling through the whole thing, just the way it was written, the structure of it, just killed me.
It's a book that I can, with pleasure, dip into almost anywhere. And I think that's also one of the reasons why it's popular, because it has some sort of relationship to the serial novel, like the 19th century novel, like Dickens, where you have each chapter has a heading, each chapter has a narrative, each chapter has a point to it.
There are a lot of writers, and I'm one of them, who feel only partially responsible for what they write. There is an eerie feeling sometimes of being a medium. I've had a letter from Crete saying my Captain Corelli played the piano, and one from Corfu saying I knew Dr. Janis but he didn't have a daughter. Or there's a woman on Zakynthos who claims that I've written her life story without her permission, and she's really angry with me. She caused a fuss about it. So you could, if you were getting a bit Californian, interpret that as the writer being a medium. But it's probably just having a sort of an astute imagination, which I hope I do have. Looking back on all the things that I've published, it seems to me that I'm rather obsessed with the question of power. I seem to be very interested in the abuse of it. Captain Corelli's Mandolin was really about what happens to ordinary people when megalomaniacs get busy. The ordinary lives of ordinary people get destroyed when powerful people get big ideas. After the Italians changed sides in the Second World War, the Germans landed very heavy reinforcements here on the island, and the Italians didn't really know how to deal with it. They were very confused. The Germans took advantage of this until eventually there occurred the ghastliest event of all. After the Italians' soldiers had fought the Germans to the last bullet, then when they had no ammunition left, the Germans took them all prisoner, rounded them all up, and systematically set about massacring them, exterminating them. I've read that between 4,000 and 8,000 Italian soldiers were massacred, but I've just heard that it may have been as many as 20,000. And the massacres took place in different ways. Apparently 2,000 of them were taken out to sea and sunk alive in a ship. Many of them were lined up on a roadside on the other side of the water and machine gunned. No sooner had the Germans departed than the communist Andates, the partisans, came down from the hills and tried to take control of the island. This happened all over Greece. The civil war began. A vicious cycle of violence was set up. In my opinion, although many do not agree with me, the communists started it, and the violence subsequently against the communists was a reaction. But this is still a matter for great argument in Greece. This island had to live through so much. They had to live through a foreign occupation. They had to live through the massacres of the Italians. Then they had to live through the events of the Civil War. And just when everything seemed to have sorted itself out and settled down, there was this phenomenal earthquake which destroyed the whole island. It was a great thump, like God's fist below the earth. And because there was so much dust, there was almost total darkness, and people apparently thought that it was the end of the world. It was like that time during the crucifixion of Jesus Christ when complete darkness falls on the earth and the veil in the temple is rent. Everything leapt into the air, and the first thing that most people did was to rush outdoors and watch their houses collapse. There was a feeling that God himself had personally committed an injury against the people here. There is a story that one of the priests ran out of his house cursing God. In Greek communities, the priest still has a very essential role, even for those people who have no faith. He seems to be an indispensable part of the setup. My character, Dr. Janis, at one point says there is such a thing as an indispensable parasite. There are parasitic bacteria in the gut that aid digestion. I am not a religious man, I am a materialist, but even I can see that priests are a kind of bacteria that enable people to find life digestible. So, the priest here seems to have a much more intimate connection with the community than the average, say, Anglican vicar or even Roman Catholic priest in Britain. I have to say that as soon as I start talking about God or religion, I begin to feel deeply uneasy. I think that as soon as you open your mouth and talk about it, you begin to spout nonsense. And it's better, even if you have religious and spiritual leanings, just to keep quiet. There's something that Wittgenstein said, wasn't there? Whereof nothing can be said, thereof we must remain silent. It was something like that. I think that in the face of the universe's mysteries, it's best to keep quiet. Just soak them in.
I think it's a spiritual book with a small s. It's a book that gives you a certain sort of feeling, a kind of longing, if you like. I mean, I think a lot of people read it and they kind of had a longing to go and live in Kefalonia, in a village where they knew everybody and it was sunny and the community was small and people cared about each other. So I do think it is spiritual in that sense, yeah.
Dr. Janis likes to go to the Kefalonia to have his breakfast. In fact, like most Greek men, he likes to go there as often as possible. And he gets fed up with all the political squabbling and so on. He says, I cure anybody. I cure communists, I cure royalists. And if there ever comes a day when we care more about ideas than we do for each other, then we're going to end up killing each other. And I made him say that because I was anticipating the events of the Greek Civil War. But I think it's also the truth.
Dr. Janis is the real hero of the book. He's the great pillar on which the whole thing stands. At the end, when his daughter says she realizes that no one had ever loved her so purely and truly and for herself alone as her father. And she says, I remember when Belisario set him down, and I knelt beside him, blind and drunk with tears, and I cradled his bloodied head in my hands, and saw that his eyes were empty, his old eyes, looking not on me, but on the hidden world beyond. And I thought then for the first time how small and frail he was, how beaten and betrayed, and I realized that without his soul, he was so light and thin that even I could lift him. And I raised up his body and clasped his head in my breast, and a great cry came out that must have been mine, and I saw, as clearly as one sees a mountain, that he was the only man I've loved, who loved me to the end, and never bruised my heart, and never for a single moment failed me. What a thing for a daughter to say about her father. That's when she grows up. And to me, that's the one passage, if I could keep only one passage out of the book, that I'd keep.
I have to say, I think my favourite bit in the book really is the end, when you know you're kind of getting towards the end. I don't really want to say too much about what happens in the end, but you're thinking, is this tragic situation ever going to resolve itself? And I just think that there is that last scene at the end. I can't even say what it is, can I? But It's incredibly touching and fantastically written, and for me, I was just so relieved, really, that what I'm talking about happened.
And I just wanted to explode at the end of it. I just wanted to just scream at the end of it. And I have so much respect for an author that can do that and get away with that, but at the same time I hate him for it.
I hated the ending, but it made you think about the book for quite a long time afterwards, how people can be so stupid with their own lives, really.
I enjoyed the ending to the book, and I've heard some people say that, you know, they thought it was a waste and they didn't like the ending, but I thought it was a natural ending to a great story.
I suppose my fear would be that, as with anybody who has a huge success, that they become corrupted by success, not financially corrupted and not morally corrupted, but success breeds a sort of self-consciousness, and the more one talks about how de Bernières achieves his effects, the greater the danger is that you make it impossible for him to reproduce or amplify or diversify his effects. He's a very, very skillful, generous, humane and imaginative writer, and I just hope to hell he goes on writing.
I know more or less what my next 4 or 5 novels are going to be. I don't, however, have any clue what order I'm going to do them in, except for the next one. And I don't know how long they're going to take. So I think I've got enough to keep me busy for about a decade at least. Since writing Captain Corelli's Mandolin, my life has changed a great deal. In the process of writing the book, I think I probably exorcised some of my personal ghosts. It caused me to think a great deal about all sorts of moral and personal issues. That happens to any writer who's writing a novel with lots of characters. And the subsequent success of the book has meant that I'm now financially secure. I feel much more self-confident, and I feel in general very contented, because I think that after 40, 42 years of life, I've finally set myself on the right track. I know what I'm doing, what I'm here for.